The Identity Parade, a visual arts novel. The story of Simon Paternoster and Zoe Treveris. The Identity Parade is a novel.
I think it's a very important work of art. I can safely say I've never seen anything quite like it before. Simon was trying to reach beyond language, really, to express things which are really very difficult to put into words.
It's extremely powerful, almost frighteningly so, because when he deals with things like depression, it's not a theoretical piece of writing, it's born of experience.
It was a journal-like daily process. He obviously deeply felt and looked back at what had happened to him, but also it was about being right there and now in the present moment.
I was looking for pages of this visual arts novel, which started out about 10 years before he died. The more I worked with the pages, the more I saw in what Simon was trying to do.
What impressed me when I first got to know Simon's work was that this was very extensive. It was extraordinary. It was clearly this wonderful thread going right the way through. There was a consistency of concept which I found quite remarkable and unique. I don't think there's anyone that has done anything quite as unique.
Simon Paternoster lives in a flat on the White Reed Road. Simon's flat. He lives over a 23-hour-a-day shop. There's an alley at the back. He doesn't know what goes on there.
There was a big difference between us. There were 11 years difference. And when I was 20, my folks moved from Birmingham to a little place called Retford in Nottinghamshire. Simon grew up in Retford and had a wonderful time there, I think. My father was presented with a short Oxford dictionary when he left one of his headmaster posts. And Simon, when he was even 8 or 9, would spend time just poring through the dictionary and learning words. He moved to Canterbury to start a degree in art history, and that didn't work out for him. He lasted 2 terms in Canterbury and then came home with a breakdown, I'm afraid, and had some time working on the railway at Retford, and then picked up. He started a degree in English and drama at Bretton Hall, linked to the University of Leeds, which he completed successfully. Sadly, he had another very serious breakdown. He was sectioned. In the days of the old Mental Health Act, I think that was quite a traumatic experience, more so than now. A lot of physical restraint involved. The effect on my mother in particular was to traumatise her completely. After Bretton Hall and after he was recovered from his breakdown, he got into creative writing. With his interest in mental health also, he and his friend started doing creative writing classes with some of the inmates at the Rampton Hospital, and that went on for a number of years. He started on poetry readings in the Retford and Mansfield and Nottingham area. He moved to Nottingham.
The Old Vic is a pub on Fletchergate in Nottingham, scene of many an entertainment, and with me is Simon Miles, local poet and coordinator of those appearing at the Old Vic during the festival. Hello Simon, nice to see you.
Hi.
Was there a time in your life when you said, I am a poet?
I suppose it was about sort of like 5 or 6 years ago when I really thought that poetry is the main thing that I wanted to do. I've been writing poetry since I was, say, 16, 17.
Simon, to finish off, can you give us one of your poems?
Yeah, I'd love to. Thanks very much. We were all the better for seeing the sea, picking our way down the steep cliff between litter and middle-aged flesh. Farewells hadn't been thought of yet, as hand in hand the thrill of the water's tide came only up to chill ankles, while the beach became quieter by every yard, though the sand was as smooth and the rock pools and shells were undisturbed.
he decided to enroll for a counselling course, and he writes about it in Caduceus, about this connection between counselling and creative writing, and how creative writing can be a way of expressing your feelings and coping with difficult situations and so on. Sadly, halfway through the course, again, he had another breakdown. And I can remember visiting him in Nottingham, 1993. We were walking around the park and he was talking non-stop and gesticulating about his ideas, clearly very high. And following that, I think there was a period of deep depression. I can remember him being at home with my parents and trying to engage with him, and he was so locked into his depression you couldn't get a word out of him. So those contrasts, and this is what he tries to explore in The Identity Parade. Well, it's a love story, first and foremost. The two key characters, Simon Paternoster and Zoe Treveriss. And the way in which they come together is in this Centre for Counselling and Human Growth and Development. It's based very loosely on his own counselling course in Nottingham. In fact, a lot of the setting of the Identity Parade you can see is vaguely disguised Nottingham.
Rainbow Bridge had much passing traffic, stumbling on its last legs, dysfunctional. Amidst the full-time staff, students and volunteers were the questionists. They'd stay for a period, do research, have experiences, move on. Indeed, Zoe was one of these. Zoe's at standstill after her circumnavigation.
The book is very beautiful. That's one thing I would immediately notice. He has a wonderful sense of colour and of the arrangement of the pieces on the page. So his eye for composition is quite remarkable. Looking at through the other lens, which I have of being a psychiatrist, I would say that it's really interesting to see someone who is having such profoundly deep and complicated experiences and trying to express them and finding perhaps that language in the sense of written words is not enough, that he has to go beyond that, into the visual, into collage. It's interesting that he was very keen on William Blake and that he's doing something which I think William Blake was doing, which is to go beyond just the written word in his poetry and to bring in illustration, to bring in the visual.
Place is so important in the Identity Parade, the way he sort of grounds the whole story in the space and in the map. There's a really strong connection with William Blake, who also does that.
After he got his certificate in counselling in Nottingham, he decided to move to Bath, where one or two friends were, and I think he felt a new start was needed.
He moved to Bath and that's when he began it, and he was making these pages every day. The whole idea was 365 pages. It was the creativity that comes out of the coincidence and yes, the sort of moment. And often he speaks about now, doesn't he, and what Zoe says about making each day, a new beginning. Anyone who came to the flat had to sit in a chair in the middle of his kitchen and be photographed. Yeah, it felt like the whole thing was part of his art, part perhaps of his book. So everyone who came was a part of the installation. We had lots of spiders, and he came down astonished by the beauty of this. I remember him saying, it's just so transparent you can hardly see it. It's so beautiful, the spider in your bathroom. There's parts of the Identity Parade where he speaks about the delicate transparency of the web and things like this, and I feel like that perhaps was inspired by the spider in our bathroom. Zoe Trouvier, her hand is poised, her hand is still. The spider thin thread, the lead plum bob, her elbow resting on the table. The pendulum turns, the pendulum spells, the spider thin thread and spinning lead.
Concrete poetry is a term which is used and abused to describe anything which has a spatial configuration on the page. So, for example, Apollinaire wrote a poem called Il pleut, It Rains, whereby the words were actually scattered across the page to represent rain. Classically, concrete poetry is very minimalistic. But on the other side of the spatial poetry side, you have people who weren't concerned with a minimalistic approach. In fact, very often they wanted a maximalistic approach. And I think in some ways Simon fits into this, both in terms of how he is trying to take the whole world in a bricolage fashion into his work, but also by being maximalistic. So when you look at the page, you not only have to take in what is written, you have to take in the whole imagery of it. And that's fine if you look at a lot of concrete poetry where you can see that and that's the end of the story. But here it just goes on and on and on like this, so it becomes very accumulative in effect.
Simon and Zoe. Simon and Zoe beside the figure of 8 lakes. Everything that comes into Simon's eyes is lit with colour. Everything like it was painted on the first day. He locks his hand in hers. Her fingers grasp his, a little cold. The palms of Simon and Zoe close together. In the sweat they make quicksilver, gold leaf.
It gets to the point where Simon is obviously quite obsessed with Zoe. You can start to see the starting point of his breakdown because he's very excited about it. He's falling in love. And of course, this is what happens. The excitement then builds to the point where it can't be contained. So he then finds himself without her companionship because she's clearly keeping a distance, and it gets to desperation, and she then sort of withdraws.
He's trying to make sense of experiences that a lot of us would never have, that are very, very intense and overwhelming. That there is a sort of narrative trajectory in the book, isn't there, where there's a period where he sort of enters into what's described as a breakdown, or even the word madness is used. I mean, obviously we wouldn't use the word madness in psychiatry, but it is, commonly used for, say, psychotic states where you would lose your sense of reality, or sort of firm sense perhaps of your own identity. And it seems to me there were periods where you get a flavour from the book of him entering into a manic or hypomanic state.
What is it within that makes him red hot? What is it, red hot? Can't get rid of the pounding, pulse, beat.
And that's one thing about hypomania, is that it's a very physical thing, which I think a lot of people don't quite realise. Your heart rate goes up. You have a strong sense of your body being wired and of your heart going fast or thumping. People often don't sleep. Because they don't sleep, their bodies get put under a lot of strain as well, actually, and people are prone to a lot of exhaustion. The manic or hypomanic states very often end with a crash into depression, and you certainly, I think, get a very strong flavour of that in Simon's book.
Not another day like this. Not another day. Closed his door behind him. The radio was on. Oh no, thought Paternoster as he lay there. It's my turn now. Lying on his side, Simon certain all his fears of oblivion, extinction, about to bear down on him. All is gridlocked in the substance around Simon Paternoster. That's how it was. This is how it was. Not another day like this. Not another day.
Which I think is a wonderful description, actually, of what so many people say about what it feels like to be depressed. It's a paralysis. It's that you don't want to do anything, you don't want to go anywhere, you see no point, you take no pleasure in anything, you have no energy, you just want to lie in bed. Lots and lots of people just lie in bed much of the day. A great sense of not going anywhere, and of monotony as well, which you get in that reading, then sort of repetition of phrases.
Sometimes when I've been reading it, I've almost sort of recoiled because I feel I'm being drawn into that state that he's writing from. He enables you to go as far as you want towards an appreciation of what it's like to be in that state of mind, both the exhilaration and the turmoil and the terrible pain that can go with that isolation. Simon believed that setting words down onto paper was itself a therapeutic process. It was a way of enabling people to break through barriers, who have been allowed through his encouragement to see that blank page almost as a confessor, as a medium through which they can come to terms with what they've been through.
Simon had been using this craft work as his own rebuilding and rediscovery. And although he says it wasn't therapy, he didn't do it as therapy, he did it as a creative piece of art. It really helped him through. It gave him purpose, and it gave him meaning to his own life, which I think is terribly important.
I felt sort of in that sort of recovery section of the book, you get a sense of the character, who's also called Simon, sort of piecing things together, trying to make sense of things. I mean, it's referred to as a resurrection, isn't it? And the visual seems to come to the fore here, that you're getting these sort of circular patterns that look almost like dials, where you're trying to calibrate something, you're trying to sort of, do some kind of map that brings the whole of it together. I have lots of questions, I suppose, in my mind about the title, The Identity Parade. That's a very important phrase for Simon's recovery, isn't it? The idea that he's somehow regaining his identity. And one thing about bipolar disorder generally is that it has a big effect on people's sense of self and sense of identity, because they're often entering states where they're, I suppose, alienated from what you might describe as their normal self.
When you put something down in black and white, it's no longer fluid and ephemeral. It becomes concrete. It can last through the centuries. It says, here I am, this is what I've been, this is what's happened to me. And it validates and empowers that individual to say, yes, here I am.
When he began in 1995, he had one concept, and it gradually evolved so that in 2005, just before he died, about 6 months before he died, he had a different view of it. The circumstances of his death came absolutely out of the blue. He was found lying outside someone's flat, and he'd had a pulmonary embolism. When I came to look at it all a year or two later, it was not at all clear how it all fitted together. And I started to try and say, oh yes, this is like a jigsaw puzzle. Here's a sequence which goes together. Here's another sequence that goes. That sequence obviously goes before this other sequence. And so gradually I built it up into what seemed to be like a running order that made sense in terms of telling this story. Well, that was my first attempt. The more I became familiar with the work, I realised that my original jigsaw solution was not an optimum by any stretch. There's another story to tell about how he put it together. There's another story to tell about being a carer for somebody like this. Also, I found it very revealing for understanding my son's mental health.
I teach medical humanities here at Oxford to medical students, so we do sessions talking about the ways in which literature, poetry, novels and so on are helpful to doctors in understanding patient experience. And I think this takes you into the inner world of someone with bipolar in a way that's almost unique in my experience, actually. It would teach people also about the way in which there are different languages for describing these experiences, and also different ways of understanding them as well. Simon understood his psychotic experiences in the context of shamanism. That is a really important thing, I think, to get across to professionals in training, that people have different understandings, different contexts, worldviews in which they locate their experiences. I cannot say that it's a book which is going to be sort of so accessible that you could leave it in doctors' waiting rooms. You know, it is immediately going to be therapeutic for people. But I suspect for some people reading it, it's going to be very therapeutic, actually. It's not always a book which is entirely accessible, but then that's true of many, many great works of art.
It's as important as anything by James Joyce, frankly, because in its sphere, the extraordinary aspect of it is that it is of a piece, a long piece, which continues to develop. And it isn't sort of over and done within a second. You can keep visiting and revisiting and revisiting and seeing new things each time.